Well, I called a very hasty warning, "Look out, hippo," which was followed by the ADC's precise and cultured plea, "You're in the game department, Vernon, what do we do now?" Well, I hastily ordered everyone into a tight inward-facing rugby scrum and hoped for the best. This very big herd must have been grazing just inland of us when they panicked and stampeded back to the lake. Well, knowing the size of the herd, I was more than anxious as the rumble approached. On sighting our solid lump, they split into two groups and launched themselves into the lake on both sides like Queen Mary's or Slipway, grunting copiously as they went. As soon as I deemed prudent, I moved the party on as if it was an everyday occurrence, but ye gods, was I worried. The shoot was really a victory for the ducks and geese. I counted a total of 134 shots for 8 geese and 10 ducks. 2 of the guns couldn't hit a bull on the arse with a banjo, to quote an old Hertfordshire keeper. They did at least get a fair selection of available species: 4 spur-winged geese, 2 knob-nosed ducks, 3 yellow-billed ducks, 4 pink-billed teal, 3 whistling ducks, a pochard, 1 Ethiopian snipe and 2 cormorants. If they'd managed to get a pygmy and Egyptian goose and a painted snipe, they would have achieved a full house. Anyway, they were all happy with the morning's adventure, and after a noisy breakfast went on their way at 8 a.m. With Peter and myself following up in the rear in case there were any mishaps on the way out. By 2 p.m. the heat and humidity in that low-lying basin would be very trying, and their bag of ducks and geese bordering on unfit for human consumption. They had 3 hours to get to civilization and refrigeration, and a thank you letter later told me that all went well. My various African rangers were now very capable, and most field matters could safely be left to them, leaving me to attend more to biology and game matters. During my 13 years in the bush, I was called out several times to deal with a variety of happenings, so I'll mention a few that seem to have a more permanent place in my memory. It was customary, when travelling within one's own province, to call on all isolated bungalows, particularly if the inhabitants were acquaintances or new arrivals, and it was one such call in the 1950s that has often caused me to wonder about the possible outcome if I had not called in that night. The Coates bungalow at Njaqua was at the end of a short and very steep drive. The bungalow backed onto a steep sloping background of very large granite boulders, some of which came almost level with the rear eaves. Well, it was pitch dark, and the lights from their tilly lamps shone brightly through their uncurtained windows, and as I drove up the drive, my headlights revealed the bright reflective eyes of a large leopard crouching on the small recessed porch roof, which covered the entrance steps leading down to the driveway. Well, there it was, in the full glare of the headlights, with its front paws almost in the gutter. Well, I now saw Mr. Coates walking across his sitting room carrying a tilly lamp. He was coming to greet the new arrival. Well, it was obvious that I was not going to have time to consider alternatives, as Mr. Coates was about to pass about 12 inches below this crouching animal. I was just returning from a reported lion attack on a cyclist, and slid out of the car with my shotgun, which was already loaded with 2 3/4-inch LG cartridges. Well, I shouted a warning to Mr. Coates, who obviously didn't understand, and fired at a range of some 12 yards. Well, the leopard fell dead at his feet, which must have been an awful shock to him. He later said he thought he was being assassinated as he experienced the flash and explosion of my gun within a few yards of his face. Well, I can well understand the trauma. After a stiff whisky and a bit of stuttering, he began to recover, and an hour later I had the leopard removed from my vehicle and returned to Nyassaland. A long, eventful and rather tiring day. During those early years in Africa, I greatly missed the companionship of a sporting dog, and was really delighted to take delivery of a small black female Labrador puppy in 1952. I called her Sally, and she travelled over 1,000 miles from southern Rhodesia when I collected her from Mzuzu, and not surprisingly, it was a nervous little bundle. I kept her inside my jacket for the journey to Nyassaland. After half an hour or so, we stopped at a small shallow stream for a drink of water and a sniff round. Well, it was obvious we were going to get along together from the speed with which she scrambled back into my jacket when we resumed our journey. We shot and fished together for 10 long happy years, and then one morning she didn't come for her breakfast and lay peacefully dead in my chair. Before saying farewell to Sally, there is one story that I must tell you. Not for over-sentimental reasons, I will just call it paid in full. I was sitting at the edge of a deep muddy channel some 30 feet wide, and Sally was sitting close beside me. It was the outlet to the Ndere marsh. This channel had a 6-foot fringe of Nile water cabbage which came almost to my feet. I was waiting for ducks to come flighting up or down the channel. Well, have you ever had that feeling of impending doom when those tiny individual hairs, or invisible hairs, on the back of your neck try to tell you that something somewhere isn't quite right? Well, it was Sally's fidgety standing up, sitting down, occasional whine that troubled me. It was very unusual for her not to concentrate her attention on the direction in which I was looking, and to remain alert and still. Well, thinking perhaps some ill-intentioned creature was lurking or approaching through the tall grass, I silently changed the cartridges and slipped the safety catch off my shotgun. Well, this small but audible click always pricked her ears up and concentrated her attention directly onto anything interesting or imminent. I followed her gaze to a large raised mound in that fringe of Nile water cabbage, and not 5 feet from my legs, through the gaps in the dangling roots, I saw 2 wide apart yellow-flecked eyes with black bar centres. Well, I can tell you Wyatt Earp would have been proud of the speed with which I fired those 2 point-blank shots of that evil-looking head. We then had a deluge of water and cabbages over both of us, and I still think that I may owe Sally several years of my life. My enthusiasm that evening for duck and green peas was very dampened. It's now 32 years since I left Nyassaland. I often wonder how the experimental stocking of all those streams and dams has finally turned out, particularly rivers like the Kizibi and North Rumpi, or the Big Luawa Dam 3,000 feet up on the Vipia Highlands, which reminds me of a 200-mile trip in the early hours of the morning. I was carrying a consignment of fingerlings in a 44-gallon drum up to Luawa Dam, and had an uncomfortable brush with the pride of lions. I had an African ranger in the back of the truck to keep an eye on the wedges and the drum. It was cold and misty, and the ranger was completely draped in a grubby brown and grey striped blanket, and looking for all the world like a large African antelope. The last thing you need on a trip like this is a puncture, which is exactly what we did get. It was barely light, and after some manoeuvring on the rutted track, I found a firm level spot for the jack. Now, the ranger, still completely draped and hooded in his blanket, was operating the jack and had removed the wheel. I was on the back extracting the spare wheel. On looking up, I saw to my horror that we were in the middle of a large pride of lions, and 2 lionesses were making a very purposeful approach to that unsuspecting blanket. Well, the speed with which we both entered and secured the front cab is something that I'd love to see on a video. The blanket lay discarded on the ground and was being pawed by one lioness, while the second one put his dirty feet up on the bonnet and stared malevolently at me through the windscreen, and it then proceeded to bite off the moving wiper blade and cover the windscreen with its slobber. I was now petrified that the jack would give way, and we would then be in one hell of a pickle. I applied the horn vigorously, which had some effect. The lady on the bonnet got down and joined the lady with the blanket, and they proceeded to try and divide it between them. One then tired of the game and went to rejoin the rest of the group, which as far as I could see comprised 9 females, 3 of which were very well grown cubs. The second lioness now moved away and joined the rest, and they all slowly wandered on their way, and as soon as they were well clear, it was a case of cautious exit and lookout and a very high speed wheel change. We then went on our way with a slobber all over the windscreen, a torn muddy blanket, and a pathetic looking windscreen wiper. And whilst on the subject of cats, I had two unusual happenings with leopards, both within a mile of our Nyassaland bungalow. One involved a call out at dusk to attend to a leopard which had entered a small thatched chicken house on pole supports. It had been trapped in the house by one of the villagers who had thrust a spear across the entrance. This was an unnecessary death, as the entry ladder should have been moved and the entrance itself closed well before dark in the customary fashion. The second incident was more serious, and again to some extent self-inflicted. It started with a rather breathless runner arriving at the bungalow to report that a man had been badly scalped from behind whilst working in his maize garden. Well, I found him sitting on the side of the road smoking a shriveled homemade cigarette. He was caked in blood and flies. In spite of this, he wanted to lead me to his garden and was primarily concerned about the collection of his ripe maize cobs. He then insisted that his wife went immediately to perform this task, which was obviously very unwise, and obviously he didn't overvalue her services. His garden was a mile or so into the Nika foothills, and several young men volunteered to guide me. I chose one who spoke some community school English and looked fairly calm. Off I went after giving instructions to keep the flies off that dreadful wound. I was armed with my shotgun and a few 2 3/4 SSG cartridges, as it would probably be a fairly close encounter, if in fact this leopard was still lying up in the garden, which seemed unlikely, as some 2 hours had elapsed since the attack. On arrival at his garden, I noted that it was surrounded by several other small gardens on this well-cultivated slope. Their seemingly unconcerned owners were engaged in various horticultural activities. I now reconsidered my opinion as to the likely presence of this leopard, as those many sharp eyes would probably have seen the leopard departing from the scene. The victim's garden was a narrow strip about 30 yards wide running downhill. This was convenient, as it enabled me to command a reasonable field of fire among the brown and partly harvested maize stalks. About halfway down this strip, the unfortunate animal charged without warning from my left. It fell dead a few yards from where I stood. I say unfortunate because it was trailing a snare tied to a short broken post, which was obviously hampering its charge. The snare had been set in the garden for marauding pigs, which had been damaging his crop. Of course, nothing about this hazard had been mentioned to me by the owner. I suppose, to be fair, he may not have known about this situation if he had been attacked from behind. Well, pigs are a favourite leopard meal, and probably the most effective natural control there is for pig trouble, and therefore one of the best friends a maize farmer can have. And as soon as the surrounding women workers saw the dead leopard, they started their usual incessant yodeling cries, which usually proclaimed for miles that something good or successful had happened. My young guide then proudly draped the leopard across his shoulders, and we returned to the roadside, where we were met by the usual crowd of happy locals and drum messaging. The next thing was some first aid for that dreadful scalp wound. He now looked incredibly funny, with his head enclosed in a banana leaf bonnet with an extra long bent cigarette sticking out of the middle. Hopefully my laughter was construed as my pleasure at their welcome. Well, on arrival back at the bungalow with the injured man, I appeared to have a visitor. A cheerful young man came forward with outstretched hand and said, "I'm Dr. Gould. I was told to call in on you. I'm on my way to Tanganyika." Well, this had to be one of life's premier coincidences. My brain had been working overtime on how I was going to treat this wound. I had mended panga slashes, spear wounds, jungle sores, nasty burns, but this was something else. My first words were, "This man has had an argument with a leopard. Will you have a look at him?" "Surely. Poor chap. What a mess." Well, I had no idea how strong human skin was, as the top of his head was literally hauled back over his skull, and almost to his eyebrows, using artery forceps, sticky tape and blanket stitches. There were gaps, but I realized how much bigger my gaps would have been.